Okay. So we are delighted this morning to welcome Dr. Susan Hylen. She teaches courses in New Testament at Candler and in Emory's Graduate Division of Religion, equipping students to become responsible interpreters of the biblical text. She has authored 2 books on the history of women in the New Testament and early church, which offer a new way of interpreting the diverse and often contradictory evidence about the participation of women. She is also the author of 3 books on the Gospel of John, as well as a number of other book chapters, essays, and articles. Her current research explores the social construction of gender in the early church period.
So you're on the screen or move the
She's a ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. She serves the Candler community and the Academy, contributing to several communities, advisory, and editorial boards, including a role as associate editor for the Journal of Biblical Literature. She's a frequent lecturer at church, conference, and teaching events, and she was recently awarded the Teacher Scholar Vital Worship Grant from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And in 2017, she received the Excellence in Teaching and Pedagogy Award from the Center for Women at Emory and the Emory Alumni Association. Susan, we are so glad to have you. And now I'll say a quick prayer and turn it over to Susan. Dear God, thank you for this Sunday. And as winter weather threatens, we welcome this opportunity to gather virtually. We are especially grateful to be hosting Dr. Hylen and to learn from her research and study into the women of the New Testament. Please open our minds and hearts to hear her message and your words. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. With that.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you all for having me. It's a delight to be with you and to get to see you at least virtually. I'm so sorry that we can't be in person today, but as you said, it's turned out for the best after all that we planned it this way. So I'm going to share my screen and start my slideshow for you. All right, can you see it? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. All right, awesome. I'm going to be talking about women in the world of the New Testament mostly, and then at the very end, we're going to use that information to reflect back on women in the New Testament. When we read the New Testament, we make what are, for us, assumptions about what ancient women were like, right? We're reading and we're trying to figure out how would the first readers of, say, the Gospel of Mark have understood what Mark implies and doesn't say directly. And as I started studying this topic, what I realized is that a lot of the assumptions that we make about the ancient world are actually wrong. It was news to me. I had not known this either, but I think that as students come into my classroom, as I travel to churches to teach, I'm still hearing a lot of the same assumptions that we make about ancient women, which I would summarize as saying women couldn't do much. And what I want you to learn over the next 3 weeks is that those are mostly untrue assumptions. It's not that women didn't have prejudices against them and restrictions on their lives, but we have vastly overstated the degree to which those would have shaped ancient women's lives. And I think when we see that, then we will see new things in the New Testament that we maybe even didn't notice were there that suggest the kind of authority that women had and the kind of everyday tasks that they were doing on a regular basis that we didn't know about. So I'm going to invite you to look at some of the ancient evidence with me and to use it to imagine what the world that produced that evidence was like. I don't know how you learned history. I think I learned it a little bit as I found it sort of boring for the most part when I was, say, in high school. It was a lot about dates and memorizing and that sort of thing. But what I've come to realize as my work has become more historical is that history really requires an act of the imagination. You have to set aside all of your own cultural biases and the things that you know and try to look at someone else's culture from their perspective, right? And to do that means, that we set aside the things that we think we know about what it is, and we try to use the evidence that's available, historical evidence, and build upward to a portrait of what people's lives were like in the ancient period. We can't, we can't, sorry, I got distracted by that. we can't go out and interview ancient people, right? So what we have are sort of scattered evidence, different kinds of evidence, and we try to piece it together to get the best sense that we can of what women's lives were like. So I want to invite you into that process with me. And to start with, I want us to all look together at one piece of ancient evidence, which is this inscription from New Testament period, Roman Spain. And my screen isn't, oh, there we go. All right, I'm going to read it. Junia Rustica, daughter of Decamus, first and perpetual priestess in the municipium of Cartima, restored the public porticos that had decayed due to old age, gave land for a bathhouse, reimbursed the public taxes, set up a bronze statue of Mars in the forum, gave at her own cost porticos next to the bathhouse on her own land, with a pool and a statue of Cupid, and dedicated them after giving a feast and public shows. Having remitted the expense, she made and dedicated the statues that were decreed by the Council of Cartima for herself and her son, Gaius Fabius Junianus, and she likewise made and dedicated at her own cost the statue for Gaius Fabius Fabianus, her husband. All right, so I just want you to start by noticing there's a lot there in that inscription. Unmute yourself, type into the chat if you want, but just tell me one thing that you notice that interests you about the inscription.
I'm not sure if someone else is talking, but I noticed that she did several things. Oh, sorry, my video is off. Several things at her own cost. So she had her own, like, money that was her own, didn't belong to her husband or someone else in the family.
Yeah, thanks. You're right. That phrase "at her own cost" shows up multiple times, right? And that's exactly what it says. Is somebody else gonna jump in?
Also, the fact that she was allowed to do it. I don't know what hoops she had to jump through, but she obviously had approval to do these rather large projects.
That's right. And the inscription itself is evidence of that approval, right? Betty, it is showing us the she's being honored or praised for doing all of these things, right? Let's see in the chat, Colin says she's wealthy. And yeah, you can tell that by all of the different things that she's able to do with her at her own cost, right? It's not just a small amount of wealth that she's donating. She owned property, she owned a lot of property. And then Dale says, almost appears she may have supported her whole family. And yeah, can you say a little bit more about what you were thinking there, Dale?
Yeah, it's like that. It was her or her family that ran the businesses, or like she had a good trade or something, like trading in some kind of commodity or something like that, or maybe almost like a plantation owner or something. But like she was the CEO sort of the whole organization.
Yeah, and what is it in the language of the inscription that gives you that idea?
Well, that she also included her family and made that, but that she also many times, especially if you go back in ancient societies, they take care of the workers. So if you had a business and you relied on this, you made it good for them. So happy workers, happy, especially if it was in more fine goods or something and less mining or whatever. But as you got closer to the consumer, they had this kind of thing, and that's what picked up on me. She's doing things for the community, for the area, like the mill houses that they put up during the during the industrial age. Yeah,
thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, so she's doing all of these are community projects, right? It's not just she's building her own enormous house that she keeps to herself, but she's building things that are religious and civic in nature. And so a lot of people are benefiting. She's also at the end, she's giving statues for her son and her husband. So she seems to be the one in the family that perhaps has more wealth than her husband. We're not sure, but she's at least able to donate these items for them. Did somebody else just comment? Go ahead.
Susan,
Yeah.
I think that it also recognizes her as a woman, and the fact that she is so nurturing and recognizing other people, which is what women tend to do.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about that later. In some inscriptions, we get kind of more traditional feminine virtues that are mentioned. I don't see those in this particular inscription. And in fact, the language could have been used, the same language could have been used to praise a male who had done the same kinds of acts of patronage, which men also did during this time period.
Unexpectedly, unexpectedly to us, she's getting full credit. Her husband is just listed as an afterthought, and we might have expected in our experience to have, maybe she did all of that, but the credit would have gone to her husband in many cases.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Cheryl. And that is sort of our expectation of ancient women, I think, is that men made the decisions, men owned the property, right? And so to have Junia doing these things herself seems very unusual from our own sense. Let's see, is Decimus the Roman general? No, well, we don't know, but probably just a guy named, a lot of Romans have the same names, so probably just a guy named Decimus, who happened to be her father. Look at all of the verbs that are attributed to Junia for a moment. We have restored, gave, reimbursed, set up, gave, dedicated, remitted, dedicated. It just goes on and on. All of these things that Junia does herself, right? And so part of the evidence that we see in this inscription is not just that Junia is a wealthy property owner, but that she's responsible for doing these things, right? She's active with her own wealth. Now, there were a lot of women in the ancient world like Junia Rustica, and a lot of inscriptions like this have been found over the years. Certainly not as many women as men are honored in inscriptions like this, but so many that it's evidence that we really have to take into account, and it changes the way that we should view ancient women and the kinds of things that they could do. I want to talk more about why was it that Junia Rustica could do all of these amazing things? Somebody said that she was allowed to, as a comment, and that's exactly right. So what was the legal or social framework that allowed Junia and other women to take on these kinds of roles? And if we can understand that, then I think we can understand not just her, but other women as well, like women of the New Testament. All right, so the first point is that both sons and daughters were under the legal authority of their father during his lifetime. We tend to think of women being under the authority of their father, and then maybe being passed on to the authority of their husband. That's kind of a common framework. And that was true in an earlier period in the Roman world and Greek world, and in the Hebrew Bible, that it seems women were under the legal authority of their father, and then that was passed to their husband. But one of the things that that's different about this period that we don't always acknowledge is that men also were under the legal authority of their father during his lifetime. Both sons and daughters, the same thing applied. It was the same status in the legal terminology and so forth. And fathers had significant authority, but they have it over all of their children for as long as they're alive, even if their children are adults. Now, when the father died, whatever age that might be, the children became legally independent. And it's at that point that they inherited property from their father. And really before that point, the father owns all of the property, at least, in a technical legal sense. Even if the children are adults, they may have property that they use and that it functions, but technically it actually belongs to their father until he dies, and then they inherit from their father all of the property that they have. It was common in this period for sons and daughters to inherit roughly equal amounts of property. Sometimes a little bit of a benefit to the sons, but the idea at least was that it would be roughly equal. And I think that also is a surprise for our expectations. So an implication of this is that in this period, women were not under the legal authority of their husbands, ever. they're under their father's authority until he dies, and then they're legally independent. And it's those are the two legal statuses that were widely available in this period of time. Marriage doesn't change it for either men or women. It's really the relationship to the father and his presence that would have changed their capacity to own their own property and make these kinds of decisions themselves. So as a result of this, women own and manage property. And we already saw evidence of this in our friend Genia Rustica. And I just want to say, as I'm going along, if I say something that sounds strange to you and you want to jump in and ask a question, just do that and don't feel shy about it. I'll stop at some points and ask you what questions you have, but you can also just feel to interrupt me at any point.
Does that mean women could sue in their own name since they had property and might have to enforce their rights that way?
Yeah, that's right. Women could take legal action for their property, and that's one reason why we see it, right? Is that exactly what you're saying, that when you're a property owner, stuff happens, right? Somebody might try to take your property. Somebody might, infringe upon your land or something like that, and you have to go to court and say, hey, uphold my rights against so-and-so. They're on my land. I need your help to get them off. And so we, in Egypt, where written records have survived because it's so dry in the climate, right? Archaeologists have found actual written paper records. There are documents like this of women petitioning the local magistrate or the regional magistrate for legal kinds of help. And that's, again, evidence that women were property owners, number one, but also that the legal system recognized that ownership and upheld their rights. All right, so roughly a third of property in this period is owned by women. Now, that is not half, right? But it's actually, I looked this up online, if you can believe the online sources, it's about equal to today what women own globally. Women own about a third of wealth globally right now. So again, that's not parity, right? But it is substantial. And it tells you that women's property ownership was a very common, regular thing that people would have understood and known in their everyday lives. Let's see, there's another question in the chat. What if heirs obtained property independently from the father during his lifetime? Thank you, Mallory. It was possible for fathers to give permission for children to have some property of their own during his lifetime. It still technically belonged to him, but it was, on loan, as it were. Like, everyone acknowledged this was a regular practice. You couldn't have your, 25-year-old child completely unable to function without any money of their own, right? They often had a job and ran a business and did things like that. So there are practices that made that possible for both men and women. Again, the same thing applied to both, especially when they got to be of age. All right, so let's look at another, oops, I think I skipped one somehow. Oh yeah, sorry. Both elite and lower class women own property. So one of the mistakes I think that we've made previously in looking at the ancient evidence, we've seen women like Junia Rustica, and it's clear that she's fabulous, right? She's really wealthy. She's got all this money to do amazing things. And so one thing that we've said is that, well, it must just be a few women, a few of these very wealthy women who could do all of this amazing stuff. Other women's lives were totally, controlled by men, and they didn't have any advantages. And that, I think, also turns out not to be true. Now, lower class women certainly don't have the advantages of somebody like Junia Rustica, right? She has a lot of privilege, of course, because of her wealth. But what seems more accurate to say is that lower class women also own their own property. They just don't own so much of it, right? But neither do the lower class men that they are connected to either. So we want to think about the same patterns that I'm talking about for women, applying both to elite women in their own way and middle class, lower class women as well. And we're going to look at some examples of both elite and not so elite women as we go. Now, Junia Rustica, to be honest, she's not entirely an elite woman. She would have been like a local elite woman, but Cartima was not Rome, right? It was a smaller city in Roman Spain. So she's not the creme de la creme, if you will, of Roman society, but she is one of the many local elite women who was doing what needed to be done for her community to give people the kinds of advantages that Roman people wanted in those days. All right, let's look at a couple of other examples of these kinds of inscriptions. Here's a woman named Eumedia Quadratilla. It says she's daughter of Gaius, built the amphitheater and the temple for the citizens of Cassina from her own resources. So again, we get very similar kinds of languages, right? She's building an amphitheater and a temple. Seems like a lot of big building projects in her town. And again, we get that language from her own resources, sort of like Junia Rustica, where it was saying at her own cost. So clearly this money is coming from Eumedia herself. This is an interesting case because with Eumedia, we actually have multiple inscriptions from the same town that tell us a little bit more about her. So I want to show you one other one. From her own resources, Eumedia Quadratilla, daughter of Gaius, restored for the citizens of Cassinum the theater that had been adorned at the expense of her father and had collapsed due to old age. To celebrate the dedication, she gave a banquet to the decurions, the people, and the women. So Eumedia here again, from her own resources, that same language is there. Her father had built this theater and some part of it had collapsed. And so she's restoring that work. And so it's showing you they're praising Eumedia, but also the family and the family's longstanding gifts to the community in this city of Cassinum. So Polly's asking in the chat, did women hold office or public positions? And that is such a great question. I think the answer is to say not commonly, but of course women did. And we can, there is evidence of, well, and I guess we need to say, it depends on what kind of positions you mean. So women were only very rarely the leaders. You think of like Cleopatra, right? She was leader of Egypt for a period of time. There was a Jewish woman, Queen Alexandria, or Queen Shalamzion was her Hebrew name, who was in the 1st century BCE, was leader there. So there are occasions where women rise to the very top. Later on in the Roman Empire, there are Roman empresses rather than emperors, but those are unusual. But what's much more common are local leadership roles, local magistrates, and something like being the, when, the Romans were big on games, right? So when the games were being given, there was like a local official who was in charge of the games. It's not at all uncommon for women to bear those roles, especially in the provincial towns of like Asia Minor, where Paul traveled, those kinds of places, for women to have the same kinds of civic titles that men have. And so, yeah, that gives us a really different sense of what women are able to do. Let's see, Cheryl has a question. Were these inscriptions on the buildings themselves? Interesting that they all make such a point to state that these tasks are from her own resources. It is interesting, isn't it? And yes, initially, well, it depends. I imagine that the Junia Rustica inscription might have actually accompanied a statue of her that had like a beautiful image of her. And often to have a statue in a public place was one of the really great honors that a city could bestow on a citizen. In that inscription, you remember it said that she gave statues for her husband and her son too. So that idea that they were also honored for doing things, but that she was the one who funded those statues would have been important. But something like these inscriptions for Eumedia Quadratilla would exactly have been on or near the building that is actually being spoken of. The chances are, at least. Those are the two main options anyway, and it's hard to tell. Almost all of the inscriptions got moved over time. The stone would be reused for other purposes often. And so when archaeologists find them, they're often not in the location where they initially were made to be. So some of that gets lost in the in-between period. Okay, so one other thing about Eumedia is that she's actually mentioned by a literary writer, not an inscription, right? But a historian and philosopher, Pliny the Younger. And he writes of her in a letter to someone else and calling her in Latin princeps femina, which is the leading woman of her city, basically. And I include this because princeps was a common title that was used both of men and of women to identify sort of the leading figures in their city. The emperor was known as the princeps himself, like the first of all of the nation, right? But in individual cities, we see, both in Latin and Greek sources, we see that kind of language being used to identify the leading male or female, often both, in a single city.
Susan, Polly Hyatt has her hand raised.
Oh, sorry, Polly, I had to mute the picture so that I could see my screen. I'm trying to cram it all on this little tiny screen at home. Sorry, Polly, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to ask back to my question about whether or not women held office. What you said about local offices was really kind of what I was thinking, because it seems like that she not only is a philanthropist and has this sense of needing to take care of the whole community, but she apparently has influence, or these people, these examples apparently have influence as well. So my question was really around, was there any formal way they could serve the community, or they're just being generous? I think you answered it, but that was why I had that idea to ask the question, is that it just seemed like she's taking a lot of responsibility for the community herself, like someone that held office might do if they had the means.
Totally. And I do think that when I like to think of these inscriptions as the tip of the iceberg, they're the thing that's visible, right? That's still visible to us after all this time. But what made that tip of the iceberg visible was all of the stuff that's underneath, right? The water that's invisible to us now. It's the social influence that she had. It's the clout in our community, right? She's the kind of person that you would go to if you had a problem, if you needed help. And those were the people that communities sought out to take on the important roles in their in the community, whether it was civic or religious, and often these are indistinguishable in antiquity. Mallory notes that the excerpt says that Junia Rustica was a priestess. And that is exactly one of these kinds of roles that we're talking about. We think of a priestess as a simply religious role, but in the ancient world, there's no separation at all between church and state, right? And people turn to the gods for protection of the city, right? The gods are the gods are the beings who watch out for us, look over us. And so being someone who is taking on a priestly role on behalf of your whole community puts you in that kind of a role. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the titles that we get of magistrates and other things. So yeah, so women are doing those, are desirable, right? Doing those kinds of jobs, not as often as men are doing them, but they're the same jobs that men are also doing. And I think that's really important to notice. All right, let's look at one example of a woman who does not have as much wealth, but she's got something for sure. This is from Egypt. So from Tauetus, daughter of Stotoetus, the 6 camels in the vicinity of the village, which I registered in the previous 20th year, I also now register for the present 21st year of the Lord Hadrian Caesar at Socnopaiou Nessos. So Socnopaiou Nessos is this village in Egypt on the edge of the desert, where camels are big business because people are hauling things with their camels over long distances. And so Tawetis is a woman in this village who owns 6 camels. And the little fragment of a record that we have here is registering those camels with the local government because there were taxes involved. And the records actually goes on in a different hand. Someone writes, 6 camels were placed on the records of the local scribe. And another hand goes out and says, I counted 6. So they're taking this really seriously, that you have to register your camels. We have other records, exact same language, like of a man who's registering 2 camels or 4 camels. So both men and women are engaging in this economic enterprise. It's really important to the life of that village and its economic functioning. And we have women as well as men who are doing these same kinds of things. All right. You guys are doing great asking questions on the fly, so I'm not gonna stop. I do wanna say that this is what we've already been noticing, that women were patrons of their cities and of community organizations. So cities at this time didn't do a lot of taxation of their own. If they needed a temple to Aphrodite, they weren't going to gather money from the citizens in general, but often a person like Junia Rustica or Eumedia Quadratilla would step up and actually build the temple on behalf of the community. So it's one of the main ways that they got anything done, right? So it's a really important role that people are taking on in their communities. And it's really important for the city that somebody's willing to do this. And cities wanted whoever would do that for them, really, and whoever was able to do it, whether it was men or women. I think they didn't seem to care that much as long as somebody would do it. But on a smaller scale, the same thing is happening. So if you have a civic organization, maybe you have a guild of business people of a certain kind, right? So you might also have, maybe you have a building where you have your meetings, right? You have the same needs, but they're just on a smaller scale. And so people who weren't fabulously wealthy would also participate in the same patterns of behavior, of patronage and civic mindedness. They would just do it in a lesser way, if you will, or maybe less grand way than one of these fabulously wealthy people would do it. Other acts of patronage included things like making loans to other people. So if you had some money, you might give it to someone and a loan, and you could do that if you were not a super wealthy person, right? But you would just give a smaller amount of money in a loan. Let's see, Miriam is asking who benefits from public works, all or citizens? So in general, everybody benefits from public works. Most of the people in a city are probably its citizens, but there was not any checking of your membership card at the door kind of thing. And in fact, cities liked the fact that people traveled from long distances sometimes to visit the temple that was most important or prominent in that city. For example, in Ephesus, one of the important cities where Paul visited, the temple of Aphrodite was really well known and drew a lot of visitors every year. So people would come from long distances to go and pray to Aphrodite and petition her for the needs that they had. So that was a great thing for the cities, from the city's perspective, to have that kind of thing going on. And then the baths and the library and all of the other great things in Ephesus would also have been available to visitors who came as well. All right, so let's do one more inscription. This one has a different reason for it being posted, which is why I'm giving it to you. Greetings from the council and people of Myra to the magistrates of Corinth. Many of our citizens who traveled in your territory testified concerning a citizen of yours, Junia Theodora, daughter of Lucius, and the devotion and zeal which she used on their behalf, occupying herself continually for our people, particularly at the time of their arrival in your city. This is why, according her our approval for her loyalty to the city, we hold her in the greatest esteem and have decided at the same time to write to you as well in order that you may know of the gratitude of the city. So this woman, Junia Theodora, is in the city of Corinth. She's actually a contemporary of the Apostle Paul, which I think is really fascinating, even though, of course, there's no way to know that they were ever acquainted or anything, but she's living in that city at the same time that Paul ministers there. And the purpose for these, there are actually 5 inscriptions dedicated to Junia Theodora. She was clearly a very important person as well. And the purpose of honoring her was because of her her patronage of her people, but in a patronage in a more political sense. There was some sort of a political disturbance, and the people of Myra, who needed her help, appealed to her to sort of step in for them, protect them a little bit and stand up for them politically. And they are honoring Junia Theodora because of her efforts on their behalf. So women like Junia Theodora were showing that kind of social and political involvement that was hoped for by both men and women who acted as patrons in this period of time. It's not always formal political power that women have in these cases, but honestly, it's not always formal political power that men are exercising either, right? Even if we imagine that, you know, the emperor at this time is of course a male, and it would have been harder to imagine a female taking on that role. A lot of the avenues for influence that were available to both men and women were these more informal channels, using the kind of social influence that you had to benefit your city or your community or your friend or your family member in some way. And women and men are both doing these things. All right, this is one of the other inscriptions about Junia Theodora. The people of Patara have decreed, since Junia Theodora, a Roman living at Corinth, a woman of the greatest honor, living modestly, who is a friend of the Lycians, and has dedicated her life to earning the gratitude of all the Lycians, has bestowed numerous benefits also on many of our citizens, and it goes on. And what I want to notice here are the phrases, a woman of the greatest honor and living modestly. And that phrase, living modestly, especially, is kind of one of the classic feminine virtues of the ancient world, modesty. And one of the things I think is important about it, the way that it shows up in the inscriptions here, is that it's a reminder to us that the kinds of actions that Junia Theodora didn't make her appear to people of the time like she was a woman who was sort of breaking the rules and not being like a, you know, a good sort of subservient woman. In fact, they're praising her with the same virtues that suggest to us often that women didn't do those kinds of things, right? If you're supposed to be a modest woman, we imagine like you don't do very much, you kind of defer to men around you. But actually, what we see over and over again in the ancient world is both of these things happening at the same time, that women are praised for being modest or using other kinds of traditional virtues. At the same time, they're praised for sticking their necks out and doing the things that their communities need them to do. So to us, that can seem sort of contradictory, I think, but the main point I want you to see is that in the ancient world, it doesn't seem contradictory to them, that both of these things seem to go together in a complex way. And it makes a much more interesting way of thinking about the ways that these restrictive ideals, as well as the amazing things we see women doing, how that can both hang together in some way in the New Testament, as well as in the larger culture of antiquity. Can somebody tell me what time it is? Because I can't see my clock on my computer right now.
10:15.
Okay, perfect. So let's go on and talk about the New Testament. So I want us to use this background to think about New Testament passages, and we'll do this in some more detail the next couple of times. But what I want you to think about as a starting point is just the way that we see the same pattern in the New Testament language as well. In some passages, it's very clear that the New Testament shares the cultural bias that women are inferior to men. I wonder if you can think of any passages like that that come to mind that you are familiar with from the New Testament, and just shout those out or type them in the chat.
Didn't Paul say that women shouldn't speak in church?
Great, Colin. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there are two passages, one in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where it says, Paul says that women should be silent in the churches. And then also 1 Timothy 2, which is attributed to Paul at least, has instructions about women being silent. Yeah, so that's one of the biases, right? That seems to show that women should defer to men and let men speak, and not speak themselves. Anything else come to mind?
You have the rules of the household with slaves and women and children in
Yeah, that's right.
Ephesians, I think.
Right, exactly. So like Ephesians 5, wives should be submissive to their husbands, just like in a parallel, slaves should be submissive to their masters. That seems very much to suggest that there's a hierarchy, right? So those are some of the most prominent ones. And I think there are certainly some other smaller places where that happens, but you get the idea that these are sort of cultural norms out there that are shared in the New Testament as well. But we also have places in the New Testament where we see evidence of women's leadership. So what sticks out to you as an example of that?
Wasn't it one with Lois or others that were leaders of the church? And it's at the close of the letter, and he's saying, thanks for your leadership and all you've done.
That's right. So there are a number of places where Paul is thanking women. There's a concentration of them, especially in Romans 16, where there's a whole bunch of women who are, and they're not just being thanked, they are, but also Paul speaks of them as co-workers and uses titles like deacon and apostle to acknowledge the ministry that women are doing. And that seems like a really important source of that.
You have the one where Jesus is crucified and the women are watching from a distance, and they had followed him from Galilee and provided out of their means.
That's right. Yeah.
They bankrolled his ministry.
That's right. And Luke especially notes that these women have provided for Jesus. They've been with him all the time, right? So we have women who are here as followers and disciples, and they're the ones who stick with him from the crucifixion moment on, and they become the first witnesses to the resurrection. Deanna mentions the apostle Junia in Romans 16. That's a great example of one of these cases where a woman actually has a title, and an important title too. In Paul's view, in 1 Corinthians, an apostle is like the highest of the categories of leaders that he lists: apostles and prophets and teachers and so forth. Derek says, does Paul thank the women in Timothy as well? I know there are some other places where that happens, or where he mentions women who seem to be leaders. Colossians has some language like that. Philippians does. I don't remember that. Well, in Timothy, we certainly get Timothy's mother, Lois, is mentioned, and grandmother as being the ones who cultivated the faith and then passed it on to Timothy. So that might be an example. Marion says Lydia owns a business, right? So Lydia is the woman in Acts 16 who insists that Paul come and stay in her home, and becomes then one of the place where the church starts in her city, because Paul goes there. And so she should be, she's introduced as saying she's a dealer in purple cloth, right? So she's a business person, and also somebody who seems to be the head of the household, because she seems to be pretty much in charge of the whole scenario. So these are great examples. We have in the New Testament also, as well as in the culture at large, this big pattern in which we see frequent statements that aren't really challenged, that, you know, men are better than women, right? Men should be in charge, women should defer to them, and so forth. And these things sound strange to us, but they are there, and over again, we see very similar things. But at the same time, we see women taking on all kinds of leadership roles, and often doing, it seems, kind of the things that they're said not to be able to do, or that men are better able to do. And so this seems to us to be rather contradictory. But it's exactly the pattern that I want us to think about this week and then over the next 2 weeks, because I think the main mistake that we've made in the past in interpreting it, in the recent past at least, is to suggest that the sort of, you know, the statements of the rules, women should be silent, women should be submissive, to assume that that was really what shaped the whole cultural environment, and placed a lot of restrictions on women's lives, when in fact, that doesn't seem to be the case. The rules, such as they are, don't seem to restrict women from being apostles or city magistrates or patrons of various sorts. And in fact, the cultural norms actually make those rules desirable for women to take on leadership in those ways. So the connection between the two is important. All right, let's see, a couple other comments in the chat. It does seem that, Susan says, it does seem that in the New Testament, the women who have wealth are the ones who have power. And that is a very important point, Susan, I think. I think it's true in the ancient world in general, and also in the New Testament to some extent, even though we certainly have, you know, places where the New Testament is pushing back against wealth being the most important category. But nevertheless, we also see that, you know, the culture still has those values. And so women who have the kind of clout in their community that would lead them to be leaders also are, you know, the ones that show up in the New Testament as well. Deanna has a great question. Did the rules for women differ in Roman and Jewish society during New Testament times? This is a very common assumption that we've made about interpreting the Bible. We've sort of cordoned Jewish women off as if they are different from other women in the ancient world. So I would say that this very simple answer to Deanna's question is no. Jewish women's lives were not different from other women's lives during this period, as far as we can tell. We don't want to take legal verses from the Old Testament and assume that hundreds of years after they were written, they applied to Jewish women in the New Testament period in a very straightforward way, right? For one thing, the Old Testament legal material always was interpreted by the communities that were using it. So it may never have applied in a straightforward way. But in the first century, Jewish culture is also really shaped, and has been for hundreds of years, has been shaped by Hellenistic culture, by Greek culture, and by Roman culture. There's a lot of back and forth between Jewish and Roman and Greek cultures going on, and others too, Egyptian and so forth. So there's much more in common than these communities have than there are differences. And we don't have a ton of evidence from, say, the first century about Jewish women's lives, in part because it's hard to tell who is specifically Jewish in this situation. But every time we do get information about women that are clearly Jewish, it seems like they're doing the same thing that other women are doing. They own property. They've got, you know, a deed to some vineyards or something. They're petitioning the courts for various reasons. They're getting married. They're just all of the things that people are doing, Jewish or women are doing in a similar way. And in Asia Minor, we do have a couple of instances where Jewish women show up in inscriptions, and they have titles as leaders of Jewish communities too. So one woman in Asia Minor is called leader of the synagogue in her town. So we have those possibilities that the same patterns seem to affect Judaism as well. only says women listed in the genealogy of Jesus. Oh yeah, that's an interesting case too, where in Matthew, he lists women in the genealogy. So we see the importance there of women entering the story too. I want to end with this one, these two verses from the beginning of that Romans chapter 16 that I mentioned earlier. Paul says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at King Pry, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. What are some of the things that you notice in this passage that relate to all of the things that we've been talking about today?
The first thing that jumped out to me was deacon. I did not realize that women were deacons in the church. So that's really cool.
Yeah, that's right. So that same word is used there. Paul uses it in Philippians when he's addressing, elders and deacons. So we get the sense that this was an existing office almost. Who knows what they did, right? There's no way to say, but it's very clear that women are deacons. And First Timothy also mentions women deacons in that letter as well. Other things that you would lift up from these two verses?
Do whatever they require, whatever she may require from you, like do what she says.
Yeah, that's right. And it's sort of two ways. It's a helper, right? So Phoebe's clearly traveling to Rome. She may not know anybody there. Paul's helping her out with the letter of introduction, but he's also saying, help her out. And help her out because she's been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. So she's an important person and she's helped a lot of other people. So you should help her out. And you're right. I think do whatever she may require from you does sound a little bit more like, what she tells you to do, I want you to do. She seems like somebody who has authority, right? You may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints. So you want to treat her well if that's the way that you're welcoming her.
The word benefactor implies a certain sense of power as well, and beholdenness.
That's right. And that's that same sort of patron language that we've been talking about all along. We don't know exactly what Phoebe's done, but she has that kind of a role within the church that Paul is leading. So I'm just going to stop share so we can see each other here at the end. Any last questions as we're wrapping up, or observations or thoughts?
You had said when you quoted from outside the Jewish literature and the Christian literature that in this time period, what time period were those references from? First century and around?
Yeah, everything that we've looked at today is from the first century. So to make it most relevant to the New Testament.
I wonder where we went wrong.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. I wonder where we went wrong. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, throughout the early church period, women are acting as deacons and in other ordained roles, as well as other leadership roles in the church. There's a great book by Gary Madison called The Hidden History of Women's Ordination. I recommend it to you if you like history books. He argues that until the 11th century, women were commonly ordained in their churches to jobs that were important in those communities. But that something happened with the theology of ordination in the 11th or 12th century that made the priestly role something that was more of a change of ontological status, the way that we might think of, like a Catholic priest or something now. And also was something that was transferable from community to community, whereas before that, it was really more like, he argues, like a more functional role within a particular community that you would be ordained to. And he doesn't really explain why, but at that same time, it seems that they also decided, well, women really can't do that. So if you think about it that way, we've they sort of rewrote the history to be like, oh yeah, those women that seemed to be ordained before, they really weren't. But if that's true, it's really been more than half of the history of the church that we've had women in ordained leadership. And that's something that somehow has fallen out of our view, which is too bad, but it's worth reclaiming, I think. Repeat the author's name, please. Oh, I think I said it wrong, actually. Gary Macy, M-A-C-Y is his name. Oh, and Deanna found it on Amazon and put a link in the chat. Thank you, Deanna. So quick.
Well, I'll just mention too that obviously Paul waffled back and forth a good bit on women's role in the church, and possibly he was reflecting the greater society too. I don't know, but you've given me a lot to think about. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, so next week we'll talk about gendered virtues in the ancient world, and I want to help you understand why. Like, why does it appear that Paul is waffling? Because he's saying women should be silent, but then he's like uplifting Prisca and Phoebe and these other people who are clearly not silent women, right? And I think that that actually Paul, what we think of Paul as waffling, again, would have made sense to ancient people as not, they wouldn't have read it in that way. So we'll talk about gendered virtues next time, and then we'll talk explicitly about speech and silence the third week and what the social norms for speech and silence were. So thanks so much for this time today. It's been great fun to be with you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it, and so glad that our virtual format turned out to be just the way to do it this morning. So thank you everybody for coming, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you.
Thank you.